WHCR 90.3 FM, Soul Lounge Primetime. What's going on, DJ LeRoy?
It's cold out there. It's very cold.
It's real cold.
I didn't realize how a walk only from 143rd and Broadway could be so cold and chilling, you know?
Well, happy Martin Luther King's Day.
Happy, good one, MLK to you, as a matter of fact. You know what, Nightwatchman? There were those wondering whether or not you'd make it in.
I'm here, bro. So let's get it started off with a little bit Marvin Gaye, and then we're going to get it popping.
Sounds like a plan to me.
All right.
You know that to find a way to bring some loving here today. Yeah. Father, we don't need to escalate.
Yeah, you know what, Marvin? Marvin left us too soon.
Yeah, too soon. But we're back, and we're ready to get it kicking here.
Yeah, what you're telling me, actually, Nightwatchman, that you actually scheduled a guest. Is that what you're telling me?
Not only a guest, I scheduled the perfect guest for this day, because this day we kind of think about our community, we think about service. So our guest today, Glenn Martin, has really worked tirelessly for the cause of criminal justice.
Hold on, I've heard that name, Glenn Martin. Tell me about him, man.
Well, we're just going to bring him on and let him tell us about himself, but I just wanted to remember the Richard Pryor line. He went down to the court looking for justice, and all he found was
just us. Okay.
So, Glenn, welcome to Soul Lounge Primetime. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm glad to be here, and I'm definitely glad to be here on Martin Luther King Day because I'm not sure there's much else that would have got me out of my bed to come down here today. It's outside.
Well, you did pick this day, though.
That's right. All the days in the universe. This one.
He consulted his astrologist, but not his meteorologist.
That's right.
So, Glenn, tell me where it started for you, because you've obviously involved in the cause of criminal justice for some time. So before you tell us about some of the more recent things, tell us how you got started and why you developed a passion for fighting for this cause.
I appreciate the question. For me, it starts at the age of 16. I got arrested here in New York City for shoplifting in Manhattan and found myself at Rikers Island. And, you know, we treat 16-year-olds as adults in New York until relatively recently. So we're talking about decades and decades of putting kids in a place that is often referred to as Torture Island. And so I just never forgot that experience. I was only there for 2 days. The judge said he was trying to teach me a lesson. And on the second day on my way back to court, I was in a cell. Got into a fight, got stabbed 4 times, once here in my neck.
What?
And I remember going back to court and the judge releasing me that day. And I kept thinking, so what was the lesson here? You know, the lesson must have been like, this is what we have in store for you. And ever since then, I've sort of had this burning passion inside of me to see a criminal justice system that's more just. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's part of what fuels me is my personal experience with the criminal justice system. I think that experiential knowledge is important to people doing the work. You wouldn't redesign a hospital emergency room without people who were patients in that room giving some feedback about what can look differently. And I don't think we should be thinking about reforming our criminal justice system without people who've been impacted by it also having a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So, talking about having a seat at the table, let's hop to 2018 and the First Step Act, which was a remarkable achievement, even as it went unheralded. It seems like neither side really tried to take a victory lap on it. But I think you probably took a couple of quiet laps in your mind around it. Yes. So tell us a little bit about the journey.
And Nightwatchman, especially under this particular administration. So
amazing.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about the journey to get this legislation passed.
Cool. So, before I tell that story, I'll just be brief here. But, during the Obama administration, we got quite a bit done. But we did not get comprehensive criminal justice reform legislation passed during the Obama administration. And I'd remind people that I'm the person who wrote an open letter to the president, because as a formerly incarcerated person who got invited to the White House to have a discussion about criminal justice reform, I found out that I was barred from access to the White House because of my almost 20-year-old criminal record under the Obama administration. Wow. And so I bring that up because as we talk about the work I've done over the years, whether it's the effort to close Rikers here in New York or work that I've done with the Obama administration, I'm about as nonpartisan as they come. Like, I just want to get the work done. And it's not about a win for Trump. It's about a win for the people who are disproportionately impacted by our criminal justice system, namely our brothers and sisters of color who are caught up in the criminal justice system. So that's part of what drove me to actually lend my strategic thinking and resources to trying to move forward this particular bill. And I recognize that I didn't make a ton of friends, particularly amongst my progressive allies, because they saw this as a potential win for the current administration. And so what happened is that in the beginning, we started moving the bill forward, and people like Cory Booker, who has for the longest supported criminal justice reform, actually,
as a matter of fact, wasn't he doing a partnership with also
Coke, the folks on the right, you mean? Yeah, right. So he's done some partnerships with folks on the right, Coke Industries and Right on Crime and some of the other conservative-leaning organizations. But on this particular bill, maybe because it wasn't his bill, he was in opposition to the bill. And that was striking for me, that someone who's been working on criminal justice reform for so long decided that he would oppose a bill that clearly had some level of traction, particularly amongst conservatives. And I think it was the same argument that some of my allies were making, which is we don't want to give Trump a win. As someone who sat in a prison cell and every time there was a piece of legislation introduced that could potentially get me out of prison, I don't have a lot of appetite for this idea that we don't want to give Trump a win. Like, the idea is, how do we give people their liberty when we have both conservatives and progressives saying that our criminal justice system doesn't work and that it's unjust and that it costs too much and that we need to do something different? So we started working behind the scene, and what we did on this particular bill, unlike most other bills that move forward in D.C., is that we made the most significant investment in people who've actually served time in federal prison all across the country to be the voice behind this bill. And so I found myself sitting in the office of many conservative senators with people who had served time in federal prison. And when they make the argument about what those conditions are like, a woman says, I was shackled during, the birth of my child in prison, and they were correction officers standing right next to me, and I was naked and shackled, or I had a miscarriage while I was in prison and I was shackled to a gurney during that time, or I went to prison and I was shipped 1,000 miles away from home to serve 20 years in prison, or that correctional officers have no ability to de-escalate violent situations within prisons and more people get hurt. Or I'm a woman and I only get 3 maxi pads per month to deal with my monthly menstruation. And so these are all the things that are contained in this bill. Very pragmatic, sensible, and most importantly, humane policies. And so I just found it hard that the most difficult part of moving this bill forward was actually getting many of my progressive colleagues to say we should do this.
Wow. So let me say the impetus for this particular bill, your experience, no doubt. Were you getting also some allies in terms of those who were formerly incarcerated themselves, who then now had emerged from incarceration to also work with you as allies?
It was split right down the middle. I mean, people talk about folks who are formerly incarcerated as if it's a homogenous group, as if we all sort of think the same way and have the same political beliefs and so on. I found that people read the bill, particularly the first iteration of it before it had sentencing reform, and made up their mind about whether it was something that they thought they could support. And some people said yes, some people said no, and some people said, let me think about it. And the people who said, let me think about it, really said, you know what, this bill needs some sentencing reform in it for me to be supportive. And so that's something we started working harder on. And when I say we started working, I mean Van Jones and Cut 50 is the organization that really took the lead here. And I worked closely with them, and they got tons of other organizations on board. But the first 30 or so organizations that came on board to support the First Step Act were actually organizations founded and led by formerly incarcerated people all across the country. And then, of course, the flip side of it is we had to be negotiating with the White House, right? So as we were talking to Congress, we had to negotiate with the White House, and people say, well, people talk as if we were sitting there with the president having this discussion. The truth is, we can talk about this president and what it was like to actually interact with him to get this bill advanced. But it was really Jared Kushner, whose dad has actually served time in prison,
Correct.
and whose
Correct.
dad is on the board of Getting Out, Staying Out, this reentry organization right here in Harlem. And so he sort of understood it from a very up close and personal way, the way many of the people who are supporting the bill have experienced prison. And that made for a very down-to-earth, very sort of practical conversation about the things that happen on the inside, the experiences that his dad had. And at the same time, it doesn't get lost on me that he's a super privileged white man in the White House and that his dad's experience was probably
white-collar
vastly different.
crime, no doubt.
That's right, white-collar crime. Yeah.
Okay. So you would say that Jared was very, very engaged in
If it
terms
wasn't
of
for
this.
Jared, this bill wouldn't have passed. I mean,
Plain and
Jared,
simple.
as far as the White House, Jared kept the bill alive, and he was the one who kept President Trump focused.
Gotcha.
Oh
Gotcha.
my God! So you got to tell us. We want to know.
Night
Inquiring
Watchman,
minds want to know.
Night Watchman, don't start here. Not yet. Not yet.
I just want to, get
I'm
a
glad this ain't
snapshot.
TV. They would have saw my face just now.
Glenn, by the way, hello from Nina Saxon, Makiba Saxon.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
You know,
That's my people.
Yeah, exactly. Small world. You know that.
That's
Please,
right.
especially being that also you are a Harlemite.
I am a Harlemite.
Well, you were in the BK for a minute.
Yes. That's my mama's fault. That ain't my fault. As soon as I was old enough to figure it out, I was here in Harlem.
So so you grew up in New York. You in New
I
York?
did grow up here in New York. Yes. The only time I really spent a lot of time outside of New York City is when they handcuffed me and took me up north for 6 years.
Lord, my brother. Okay, where'd you go to high school here?
I went to Clara Barton and Prospect Heights.
Okay, absolutely. No,
Brooklyn,
well,
yeah.
Gotcha. Well, welcome to Harlem, man.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah.
I love me some Harlem.
I still want to hear about 45.
I thought we talked him out of that. I thought we used the Jedi mind trick. I thought he wasn't going to go back there.
A little more so, just a little tidbit. Nothing that would get you in trouble with the Secret Service.
I mean, look, here's what I'd say. I was fascinated. I have small children, and the effort to keep this president focused on this bill and to be on message and to remind him that he actually supported the bill was very similar to what it takes to get my son to drink his milk. I mean, it was just a series of repeating the same things over and over. And I mean, it did get to the point, strangely enough, where it didn't take his speechwriters for him to say publicly that he supported the bill. But you know what? We were appealing to the office of the presidency, not to the man sitting in that office. And I think that that's important for people to know. In the end, I want advocates working. If I'm marginalized, if I am silenced, because I don't believe people are voiceless. I believe that people have been silenced. And if I'm silenced and I'm sitting in a prison cell and people are advocating on my behalf, and especially right now, there's $300 million flowing in philanthropy in the field of criminal justice reform. I don't want people drawing ideological lines in the sand when it comes to my liberty. I mean, the idea that you have the luxury to stand on your soapbox and say, I'm not going to give this president a win, and then you go home to your warm home and your food and whatever else you have that I don't have while I'm sitting in a prison cell. I think people have to find humility when they're doing advocacy work, and I'm glad we're having this discussion on MLK Day, because I think Martin Luther King would have had a tremendous amount of humility and understanding that, in America, unless you have a convergence of interests where you have enough people who can influence policy and policymakers to change things, then all you're really doing is yelling and screaming and not achieving anything. And so I'm just not built like that. I want outcomes, and I want to achieve some things. I mean, the same way I went after this progressive mayor to close Rikers, the same way I went after Obama when he wouldn't let me in the White House, is the same way I'd go after this president or anyone else who's in the way of reform.
Gotcha. Well, two things. One of the things, in terms of, let's say, not really getting this to go over the hump with during the Obama administration, would you say that because of some pushback that may have been from, let's say, the right, or just simply that this was not part of his real key agenda in moving it forward?
I think it's both of those things.
Okay.
I think that, while Obama did a lot around executive power, around clemency and pardons, I mean, more pardons than the last 20 or so presidents before him combined, and that deserves some credit. I also worked on getting prison, college education back in prison. I mean, I earned a quality 2-year liberal arts degree while I was incarcerated, and that was a game changer for me. And I did work with the Obama administration to make that happen. So I don't want to, totally sort of belittle or negate all of the good things that happened during the Obama administration. But with respect to bipartisan legislation moving through Congress and making it to his desk, it's not where he spent his political capital. And I think it was a miscalculation early on in his administration not to take advantage of having control of both houses. It is what it is. But again, the idea that we should, I talked to so many Democrats during this process who kept telling me, why don't you just wait till we get the House back? That sounds great, except the Democrats have never made criminal justice reform a top priority. I mean, Nancy Pelosi just finished giving her speech, right? And
it was not in there.
It was not in there. You barely heard anything specific to people of color in there. And so, you might put out some progressive bill once you get control of the House, but the Senate is not going to take it up, and it's definitely not going to get signed by this administration.
Right.
So this happens to be, strangely enough, the most robust criminal justice reform bill passed in the last 4 or 5 decades.
Okay. Now, saying that those who have served are formerly incarcerated, you can't paint them with a broad brush. Give me some examples of some of the elements that are in the bill that says, I can't support this.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some elements in the bill with respect to expansion of prison industry. So right now, in prison, people work to make things like license plates and desks and those sort of things. And those things usually end up in office buildings, but they're also sold on the market to various businesses and so on. And so this bill does open up the door for expansion of that.
Okay.
This bill opens up the door for more private companies to come into the prison system to deliver services. Now, the truth of the matter is that currently happens, right? So it currently happens. This does put it in writing, and it creates an expansion. And so the fear from progressives is that this means more privatization of the criminal justice system. That's realistic. So people said to me, well, under this attorney general, we don't have any control over the implementation of this bill. First of all, the attorney general that was there when we were moving the bill forward is no longer there, Jeff Sessions. It's not to suggest that the one we have now is any better, but you can't pass legislation for the next 2 or 3 years. You got to pass it for the next 2 or 3 decades. Like, you got to have a long game. Right. And so the same way Obama was able to do some progressive things with policies that were passed under the Bush administration, and the same way Trump was able to do some horrible things with policies that was passed under the Obama administration, we got to remember that it really is about the implementation and not even necessarily only the language of the policy reform. And so my hope is that we get this, we got the bill passed. Great. And the implementation is going to take some time, right? There's some risk assessment tools and other things that need to be created. And that's another, concern of people. There's these risk assessment tools, these algorithmic tools that are supposed to help people in the criminal justice system make more fair decisions about whether a person should get out, how much time they should do, where they should be classified. And people like those tools are biased because the data inside of those tools come from a criminal justice system that's already racist. I get that. But if you live in New York, then you remember Mayor Bloomberg saying stop and frisk was the best thing since sliced bread. And he was also the mayor who cared about data. And when you put those two things together, when he started collecting data on stop and frisk, his own argument went down the drain.
Yes.
Because everything
Correct.
black folks been saying forever about being disproportionately stopped, about it not being
no
a good law
cause.
enforcement practice and so on. In the end, the mayor could talk all that, all that good stuff, but his own data was his downfall. And so the risk assessment piece, like, we know there's racism in our criminal justice system, but there's something to be said for collecting some data to be able to tell that story so that policymakers can do something about it. And so that's another reason I was able, at least personally, to be flexible on the inclusion of a risk assessment tools. So, look, I don't want to suggest that there aren't some things in this bill that should raise concerns, particularly because we know, as I said in the movie 13th, that systems of oppression are durable and they reinvent themselves right under your nose. Like, as you're trying to demolish an oppressive system, here comes another one to take its place. Here it is, Dr. Martin Luther King Day, and we know that our criminal justice system has become the surrogate for race-based discrimination in this country, right? Martin Luther King fought for the right to vote. That's being taken away by the criminal justice system. Access to employment, taken away by the criminal justice system. Access to education, taken away by the criminal justice system. You name it, education, equality, enfranchisement, all taken away by our criminal justice system under the name of criminal record-based discrimination. So we do have to look out to make sure we don't look up. And there's the evolution of, for instance, a digital criminal justice system, which seems to be where we're heading. The idea that we're going to use electronic monitoring as a way to keep people locked up in their homes. And this bill contains that. But there's a difference in this bill that I was able to lean into, which is it's one thing to be sitting in front of a judge and this judge might have let me go home, but since there's electronic monitoring, he says, you know what, I'm going to put you on electronic monitoring, right? Like keep this young black child tethered to the criminal justice system because there's probably no other way for him to stay out of trouble. Whereas in somewhere in Long Island right now, some kid gets to go home with a slap on the wrist. I get that. The difference here is that people are sitting in cells after having served 15, 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. And all this bill says is we're going to let you go a little bit early, but you do have to wear this electronic monitor. And as someone who has sat in a prison cell, I'm sorry, you give me that choice about a prison cell or an electronic monitor, I may find some consequences somewhere down the line, but let me go home. Let me see my family. Let me see my children. Because the fact of the matter is that the majority of people who are affected by this bill, if they were sentenced today, they wouldn't get anywhere near the amount of time that they got 20 or 30 years ago. And so it's about fairness.
Right. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring the conversation a little bit closer to home because you've also spent some time working on the issues of criminal justice here in the city and in the state. So tell us a little bit about Rikers.
So, we spend $290,000 per bed per year on Rikers Island. And people have a hard time wrapping their heads around that. And they say, no way, there's no way. But there is a way. When I was on Rikers, there were 22,000 people there. An island that was never meant to hold over like 15,000. So They just doubled the bunks, keep people in the intakes area. And it was, this is during the crack epidemic. If you grew up in New York, you sort of know it was insane back then. Yeah. And Rikers was like the repository for people that was failing out of every other system that we were neglecting. And now, when I started the campaign to close Rikers, there were a little over 11,000 people at Rikers. Today, there's closer to 8,000 people on Rikers. And the catch is this. The lower the numbers go, which is great, like clearly we're seeing a reduction in the number of people going to Rikers, but the lower the numbers go, the more it costs per person, per bed, per year. Why? Because you're still running an island. Right? So one bridge on, one bridge off, the bakery, the laundromat, the guard shifts, like all the things.
You did not say reducing of staff.
That's
just
right.
The population.
The budget has not reduced comparable to the population reduction, again, because you're running an island. So it's the most inefficient way to run a jail. And, let's move aside from the cost, because I'm not some Republican sitting here having this discussion. The fact of the matter is that place destroys our children. We send our children there, and we've been doing it for decades. I mean, this is an island that was purchased from Richard Ryker, who was a judge here in New York, who was the chief judge. And he used to go out at night with a mob and capture young black men and bring them in front of his court and then send them back into slavery in the South. Like, that's the history of Rikers Island. And I would argue that
slave catchers who, and that's who New York City purchased this particular piece of land from. And for decades now, we've run this jail there. And the fact of the matter is that here is an opportunity for us to create a smaller, fairer, more humane criminal justice system. And I was standing, I was at the mayor's inauguration. So Harry Belafonte, you name it. It was all like, we about to do this. Like, it was post Bloomberg, de Blasio coming in, Harry Belafonte standing there. And the mayor put out this vision for the world, right? A vision of, a tale of two cities he talked about. And I was excited. And I got online to take a picture with the mayor like everybody else. And when I got up to the mayor, it was a cold day like this. When I finally got in City Hall and I got up to the mayor, I looked up and I said, everybody looks up. He's like 8 feet tall. Yeah, that's right.
And I said, Mr. Mayor, with all due respect, I'm not here to take a picture. We could take a picture anytime. I'm here to tell you should close Rikers. And so that was the first time I said out loud to anyone that we should close Rikers. He looked down at me and he was like, well, why would you suggest that? Aren't there things we can do to reform Rikers? And I was like, Mr. Mayor, just give me a chance to have a conversation with you. I'm going to convince you that we can close Rikers. It took me $3.5 million and another 18 months chasing this mayor all over this country to get him to finally say, oh, yeah, you're right. We should close Rikers.
So he wasn't initially feeling it.
he not only wasn't feeling it, like he took this campaign and he put it right up in front of him. He did not put us behind his back. We could have rolled with him to the finish line. He decided to oppose the campaign. And look, he believed, maybe he actually believed that he could reform Rikers. And he did that by pouring more money into it. Well, how is that a freaking novel idea? I mean, every other mayor before him has decided to pour more money. That's how we got here, $290,000 per bed per year. And I think it was only we did stop the construction of a new jail on Rikers. That was a success. Okay. Then we got the kids out of solitary. It's funny because all the things that were high-hanging fruit suddenly became lower-hanging fruit, right? Like, it was like, oh, you want me to take the kids out of solitary? How are we going to do that? And as soon as we were like, you're going to close this place down, he was like, you know what? Let's get those kids out of solitary. And look, man, till this day, I hope the mayor fully turns around and believes this is the right thing to do and that it lines up with his values. But the advocates who continue to work on this particular campaign continue to have to hold the mayor and New York City accountable to moving this forward. And I will say that the mayor, hopefully, at least from what I know, is doing enough so that any subsequent mayor can't come in and decide that this should no longer happen. And look, I mean, my older brother was a correction officer for 10 years. My older brother was a federal correction officer. He's a U.S. Marshal. You know, people think this is anti-correction officers. Look, man, if you're a correction officer and you go to work and you do your job and you're safe and you keep people safe, I got no beef with correction officers. You know, my brother is a very humane human being. He cares about human dignity. You know, I think you can be in a correction officer uniform and still care about human beings and care about their outcomes. I mean, it was someone in prison who said to me, who worked in prison, who said to me, look at your grades, you should go to college. You know, and people ask me what turned my life around. I could say it was a college degree, but honestly, it's that human being who said to me, you should go to college. And so correction officers have a chance to make an investment in people who are sitting in prison every single day, because that person probably didn't realize that saying to me, you should go to college, the first time anyone had ever said that to me, would lead to me standing in the White House having a conversation with the President of the United States about bringing education back to our criminal justice system. And we all have the ability to have that sort of impact on the lives of impressionable young people, and especially correction officers.
Wow. So Night Watchman.
I think it's time to take a break, play a little bit of music, and then give our guest a chance to catch his breath.
Okay.
He's been dropping the knowledge for us.
I mean, I did not realize that, you know, he's an ever-ready battery, man.
Well, listen, this man, before we go to the music,
okay,
I asked my original question because I sensed that there was a personal drive behind his passion. And he shared that with us. Yes. And that's what it's about. It's taking what our experiences are and doing something better and bigger.
Got it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So let's kick it off a little bit. All right.
Soul Lounge Primetime.
Sure enough.
Martin Luther King Day edition with our guest Glenn Martin. We've been talking about criminal justice reform at the federal, state, and city level.
Well, man, you should have heard what we were talking offline. Ooh, Lord. So, one of the things that also had come to my mind, the neighborhoods really affected most profoundly have been those with the quote-unquote war on drugs. So now we know about the legislation that's going to be passed. It's a matter of time in terms of the legalization of marijuana, cannabis. And now we do know that those right now, as it stands, those people who may have had any brush with the criminal justice system are prevented from actually receiving any benefit as it relates to maybe a franchise opportunity, maybe investing, owning a share in this. What's being done to address that?
I'm glad you asked that question because this governor, this governor has been good on pardons for people who I think absolutely deserve it and who didn't get justice in the courts, and for people to help them avoid immigration consequences. At the same time, this governor has also been good at rhetorically, sort of sharing what his vision is for criminal justice reform and then not delivering. And so here's a session coming up where, again, the governor in his State of the State address talked about the importance of criminal justice reform, focused on bail reform and speedy trial and discovery reform, but also he talked about legalization of marijuana. And we've people of color looking at what's happened in other states should be leery about exactly what you brought up. The idea that the people who've been most harmed, most decimated by our current drug laws are probably the folks who will end up benefiting the least from the legalization of marijuana. Except, I will say this. There have been many conversations happening on the second floor in Albany, the governor's office, around the importance of crafting a piece of legislation that actually is as narrow as possible with respect to people with criminal records having the ability to open up
dispensaries.
Dispensaries here in New York City. There are some nonprofits trying to get out ahead of the big pharmaceutical companies, because I think that's where we have to watch out, right? Like the people who are going to come for this are the folks who stand to reap the most profits from it, namely the large pharmaceutical companies. And so at this point, actually, I worry about those companies even more than I worry about the governor and his positioning here, because I think the governor finally realizes, maybe it's because he has hopes of ending up in D.C., but he realizes that this is a win, and New Jersey is out ahead of us. So it's also...
Well, I also think it was Massachusetts first and then New Jersey. And I early on predicted that he would change his ways when he started to see revenue flowing to neighboring states.
You got it.
So he's nothing if not pragmatic.
Absolutely. He is shrewd.
And it's funny, when the legalization of medical was being passed, I went to a seminar that was sponsored by Cranes. So it was a room full of young millennial white folks primarily looking at the opportunity, and they were sharing, well, how do we get into this on a business level? And the answer was, well, you had to have experience growing, but you had to have not had a record. So it was like, okay, so if you were a good enough criminal that never got caught, then you had the right experience to hopefully get one of the licenses. And then when they finally granted, they only initially granted 5 companies. And then another 5 companies. And the way the law was structured, it could have been made to make it more inclusive of smaller businesses, but they made it so that each company had to handle every aspect of
the growing, the distribution,
transportation, and distribution,
security,
which put it out of the reach of many, many businesses.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that is going to be interesting in terms of recreational is how they deal with the aspect of personal growing, and how, and what are the limits to what a person or a small entity can grow or not grow, because that's going to affect it. If they try to make it like like alcohol. Well, alcohol is a very tightly controlled industry where there are a few billionaires at the top, and pretty much none of them look like us. Maybe,
That's right.
Well, maybe now you have Sean Combs, who has actually slipped into the alcohol world,
Right.
and has made a significant splash in it. But other than that, that's pretty much that industry has pretty much been controlled by other people.
Right.
And so we need to watch that. There are a lot of different side industries that can come out of this, including hospitality, including food and beverage, that are going to be interesting. And I think that there are many opportunities, but if they try the same approach that they took with medical, there's no opportunity.
No opportunity.
I agree with that. I think there's some lessons that have been learned along the way. And, you said we have to keep an eye on it. The truth of the matter is that people of color need to be paying attention right now. Right now. Like, forget about after the legislation passes and implementation. We need to recognize that there are moneyed interests right now helping to shape what that legislation looks like. And if there's ever a point that we need to be involved, it's actually right now.
Gotcha.
Now, you mentioned something about criminal bail reform. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So we have moneyed bail here in New York State. And so when you look at Rikers Island, for instance, some people say, well, why would you even work to close down Rikers and have a smaller criminal justice system when those people are there because they did something wrong? The fact of the matter is that 85% of people at Rikers are not convicted of a crime at all. And the majority of them are there simply because they cannot afford bail. And for some people, that bail is relatively low, $200, $500, $1,000, except as someone who grew up on public assistance, like, you get $1,000, you spend $1,000. You don't have $1,000 sitting around waiting to bail someone out. And so, in America, our Constitution allows for people who've been charged with crimes, sometimes really serious crimes, to live amongst us while they are, fighting their, the charges. And yet, here in New York, we have a very powerful lobby from the bail industry that protects moneyed bail. And so places across the country have recognized that and have been moving towards eliminating money bail, except it's not that easy. The question is, what do you put in its place? In New York, we're not supposed to consider dangerousness when deciding how much to issue in bail, but human beings being what they are, you have to assume that judges are sitting there thinking about whether this person is dangerous. And you have to also assume that the darker the skin, the more we assume dangerousness, because that is just who we are. That's how we're built, whether it's conscious bias or subconscious bias or, whatever term you want to give to it, outward racism. But the fact of the matter is that the darker the skin, the more chance that the court's decision-making lends itself towards the fact that you may be, quote-unquote, dangerous. So that's part of why we have this huge population of people at Rikers. And so our governor has stood up 3 years in a row now saying that we have a very biased bail system and we need to do something about it. And now the devil's in the details. The question is, where are we going to land with this? The advocates are split in terms of exactly what should happen around bail reform. But one thing I do know is that it should not only be what I've been hearing people say over and over, which is we need to get rid of cash bail, because the unintended consequences of getting rid of cash bail, particularly if we put other forms of supervision up front, what's called pretrial supervision, in some ways, the more sort of onerous you make the things that people need to do to stay out of jail, is the more chance of pulling them deeper into the criminal justice system. It's called net widening. The idea that, again, if you go to some of the most wealthy parts of New York State, if you're a young white kid, the difference between stealing a car and borrowing a car has a lot to do with your class and your race. And so kids get picked up for the same thing here in New York City, poor kids, especially in the Bronx and other parts of the city. And so let's keep that in mind. First of all, that kids here are treated differently based on race, based on class, and so on. And what I worry about is that if we get rid of cash bail, but we put these very sort of onerous things that people need to do up front, at the time when people are innocent, that what judges tend to do is when you screw up and come back in front of them, they say, well, I gave you a chance and you screwed up, and now I'm going to treat you more harshly. And so in some ways, you should have just left me alone in the first place, because the fact of the matter is that now you're punishing me for something that if I were a rich white kid in the suburbs somewhere, I would get, without a second thought. Right? Which is the idea that he actually may be innocent. And that kid kind of looks like my kid or like my grandkid. And I see opportunity in this kid. So, let's send him home. His parents are here in the court. Let's send him home. And so that's the other thing people just don't think about. People are like, well, let's put him on probation. Let's put him on electronic monitoring. Let's put him in alternative to incarceration programs. That's the other thing. People might think because I'm a criminal justice advocate, the idea of alternative to incarceration programs is like where I put all my stock. But those programs can be just as bad. Like if some white kid is going home for the same crime 20 miles away, let me take my butt home. Don't put me in a program that's 3 months from now going to tell the judge I stayed out late or I smoked some weed, and now suddenly I'm actually facing more punishment than I would have faced if you would have let me go in the first place.
Wow. So you had also mentioned briefly that you contributed toward the 13th documentary?
Yeah, I'm in the 13th documentary, yes.
So the 13th documentary, Michelle Alexander, that's all part of what I've noticed is that we're getting smarter intellectually about the systems that have been driving us. And I thought, number one, that should have gotten an Oscar. It was too scary, but it was so excellently put together in terms of just dispassionately laying out the connection and the case of the prison industrial complex. Michelle Alexander also in her book, The New Jim Crow. And so do you think that has also contributed to an environment where we can get more done because we've got more of a group mindset about understanding the underpinnings of all of this?
That's a really good question. So I think that social justice issues, until they get popularized, it's hard to get traction. And I've been working on this issue for a couple of decades, arguably even while I was in prison. And what I've noticed is that the more people like Ava, like Michelle Alexander, like John Legend, like Meek Mill, all these other folks. In fact, I'm going to an event this week where Meek Mill is going to be announcing his work with billionaire Mike Rubin on this particular issue. We're definitely at a tipping point where the average American is like, oh, yeah, something about our criminal justice system is not working, even if they don't know the details. And as a social justice advocate, you want people to really get what's wrong with it. But if you look historically in this country or elsewhere, that's just not how movements hit tipping points. People just have some general sense of people end up using words like it's not fair, it's not just, it's not legitimate. That's when you're about to hit a tipping point. Rarely will you get people to understand the nuance of things. And if we look historically at things like the civil rights movement, we tend to romanticize movements and talk about them as if they were linear. This happened, that happened, this happened, that happened, and then boom, you hit a tipping point and the civil rights bill passed. Except if you talk to people who lived through that, they were like, it was nothing like that. We weren't sure. We were just doing it all, throwing it all up against the wall. We had some strategy here, no strategy there. We didn't know that was going to work. And so similarly here, who knows what the tipping point was? It could have been Michelle's book. It could have been Ava's film. There's so many different things that have happened over the last 2 decades. But definitely in the last 7 or 8 years or so, there's been a level of traction that I've never seen before. And yes, I believe that now it's in the public's consciousness that now is the chance to get as much done as we're going to be able to accomplish. Because the other thing that I know is that this stuff is cyclical and people get fatigued. And especially now with social media and everything else, people, our attention span is just less and less and less. And it is only a matter of time before we look up again and realize that this is just not the issue of the day. And so we have to accomplish as much as possible while we have the momentum at our backs.
Gotcha. Speaking of books, any conversations with Flores Forbes, especially with Invisible Men?
Yeah, so Flores is an ally of mine. He was a good friend of Eddie Ellis, who we talked about when we weren't on the air. Someone who I looked up to, someone who gave me the courage to do this work. Rest in peace. May he rest in peace. And so Flores, I mean, the fact that that brother is sitting where he sits at Columbia University is heartening for me. And more importantly, the fact that he not only talks about his journey to get there, but also that he leverages the resources of that very elite institution that sits here in Harlem, Morningside. Morningside Heights. Harlem. There you go. But the fact that he actually leverages the resources of that institution, particularly around what he cares about, criminal justice reform, I have a tremendous amount of respect for him, and I've read his books, and they're always so compelling. But particularly for me, it's the journey. I think that, you know, the reason we don't achieve criminal justice reform is because America has done a good job of defining people in prison as offenders, inmates, convicts, prisoners, all things that are meant to dehumanize people in the system. And so people like Flores, people like myself, other people who've been in the system, who have the ability to say, oh, I'm a father, a brother, a sister, a mother, an uncle, a neighbor, things to just rehumanize folks. Because if we don't think of people as human beings, then why should we bend over backwards to do anything that treat them the way we would treat other human beings? Let's just keep treating them the way we do now. And if you look at, you know, Bill Clinton, if you look at Ronald Reagan, if you look at Nixon, you know, these folks actually did an amazing job of calling us animals and all the other things that would allow people to say, oh, yeah, lock them up and throw away the key. That's what we've said for decades. But I do think folks like Flores being in such a position of power on the executive team at Columbia University helps to rehumanize folks who've been in the criminal justice system.
That speaking of which, in terms of these elected officials, do you think that Hillary's comment of super predator had anything to do with her, not doing well in 2016?
I think she deserved everything she got. You know, the fact of the matter is that her and her husband destroyed so many lives of people of color in this country as a result of their tough on crime rhetoric and their moving the party to the center. I'm putting quotes around that because I would argue they moved the party to the right.
So you do not buy that thing of the first black president being Bill Clinton.
Well, let's just say they found out that their black card had an expiration date.
That's right.
And the expiration date came out from, again, us starting to understand our own missteps in terms of looking back and seeing what the effects were. And again, you know, all the credit has to be given to, and not just Michelle Alexander and Ava DuVernay, but we've got many academics across this country who've done some amazing work in terms of these issues. And so I just think that there's been a collective consciousness. You mentioned Eddie Ellis and the research that he came up with. And let's talk about that.
So Eddie Ellis, you know, it's fascinating because I believe in traditional academic research. I think research is important. I think when you're spending resources, you need to have a sense of how to make the best investment with limited resources. Having said that, I think people forget that their research is a compilation of other people's anecdotes. And Eddie Ellis sat in prison in Dannemora, Clinton, and essentially got together the guys in the prison and just did a survey, like, where do you come from in New York? You know, where were you living before you got incarcerated? What was your income level before you got incarcerated? And I would argue put out a seminal piece of research that showed that in New York State, when we had 70,000 people in prison, that the majority of those people, almost 90%, actually came from 7 very specific communities here in New York City. And he named those communities Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, East New York. And this was like Bed-Stuy, do or die Bed-Stuy, not the Bed-Stuy we know today with the cute, trendy little shops. But, you know, Eddie was a hero of mine because not only was he formerly incarcerated and willing to stand up and say, I served time, but here's what I learned about the system and here's what we should be doing differently. But he actually produced original research that people ended up co-opting later on. I mean, there was research later on called $1 Million Blocks that showed that there were certain blocks in New York City where we were spending $1 million every year repeatedly to keep locking people up, or certain precincts where we were spending $30 million each year to lock people up in East New York and 75th Precinct. But Eddie knew that. Why? Because Eddie were talking to the people and the families who were devastated by those policies. People live and die on policy. And I think that, you know, our folks, like, we need to understand that, like, we talked about this marijuana legalization piece, like, now is the time to weigh in because people live or die on policy. And our tough on crime rhetoric and our tough on crime policies have decimated generations of black folks. And it's going to take us generations more to get back what we lost.
Gotcha. Well, you know what? You're going to have to let the people out there know if they want to actually follow up and get some more, as I say, get into the weeds in terms of the research and the advocacy that you bring. How can they do that?
So I've always prided myself on being very accessible to people, no matter where I've ended up in this world, and I want to continue to be that. And so I have an email address that just about anyone can reach out to me, and it's easy to remember. It's actually Glenn's personal email at gmail.com. Very deliberate, easy for people to remember. So it's Glenn's personal email at gmail.com. People should just drop me a line. You know, if you want to talk about something specific to a family
that's Glenn
member.
with 2 N's.
That's Glenn with 2 N's.
That's right.
Only way to spell it.
That's the only way to spell it. If people want to talk about personal family matters, like people that are in the system that are being harmed, we can talk about that. I definitely know who's who within the correctional system and where the pressure points are to get people to show up the way they need to show up. But then if people want to talk about larger issues and get involved in the work, hit me about that also, because there's a lot of work coming up. I'm about to launch a huge initiative soon. I'm doing some of the work behind the scene it takes to be successful once you launch it. But I'm about to give this governor a real hard time.
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first. Glenn E. Martin about to give a hard time.
Right. Well, Glenn, we really want to thank you for coming on, especially coming on this particular day. We want to remind people, first of all, everybody who just kind of honored this day with a kind of mentality towards service is important. Want to mention one more thing. There are a couple of initiatives that are going on around town as far as meals for federal employees who are furloughed. I believe that Melba's restaurant is doing something tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
So check on that. And there are some other organizations that unfortunately I don't have the information. But get on social media, search around it, and let's share that information and support the people who are suffering during this time.
Thank you, Night Watchman.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Yep.
Once again, another edition of Soul Lounge Primetime. Our guest, Glenn E. Martin, and the Night Watchman.
Yeah. So we need some music to take this thing out, or
You want to do it?
yes. It looks like you're packed up. So.
Well, what's up next?
What's up next is Harlem Dance Party with DJ Soul of Acton.
That's
That
it.
was a great interview.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Almost didn't want to interrupt you guys.
All right.
But the show must go on.
Thank you.